Welcome to another Trench Chat on the Old Front Line, and I'm really pleased this week to be joined by Richard Fisher of the Vickers Machine Gun Collection and Research Association to talk about machine guns in the Great War. Welcome, Richard.
Hi there, Paul.
Thanks for joining us. Obviously, I always start this and ask people, do they have a personal connection to the Great War which has brought them to this subject?
Yeah, so I do, but it hasn't brought me to this subject. So my connection to the Great War is a really local one. I mean, I suppose in a roundabout way it does bring me to the subject, but it started with, as many people's collections do, some family medals. We were cleaning out some of the houses from the family back in the early 90s, and I was 9 or 10 years old, and showed an interest. So very much, given the medals, death penny and certificates for my great uncle, who was in the 6th Battalion Wiltshire Regiment and killed on 21st of March 1918. He served alongside his brother from when they signed up in 1914 into the Royal Wiltshire Yeomanry, and with the infanterization of that in 17, they became 6th Battalion, and that got me interested in military things, as things happen at that age, which got me talking to my grandfather. So actually, my great-great-uncle's nephew, my grandfather, who was a Vickers machine gunner in the Second World War in the Cheshire Regiment, and served at Anzio. So so my sort of geographical sort of connection to the Great War is, with the Vickers machine gun, is with Italy, and I've been over there a few times, probably more times than I've been to the Western Front actually. And the Western Front has always been sort of something I've passed through. I've been on a couple of trips over there, but passed through. But then the Vickers machine gun itself is what interested me from Pa's interest, and 26 years ago now, we went on a trip to the Royal Marines Museum in Southsea, and he sat there and took one apart that was on display, and I was sort of hooked from then on. But the Vickers machine gun doesn't just encompass the Second World War. It doesn't just encompass the Great War. So it gives me a lens to look through, to look at many different conflicts, but obviously, the role of the machine guns in the Great War and the role of the Machine Gun Corps as it was established and things like that are a key area for what I now study and for what the association does.
And obviously that's extended to you now collecting different aspects and artifacts connected to machine guns. I mean, we can't see it on the podcast, but you're sitting there with two mannequins of a couple of war horses behind you and some machine guns and ammo tins everywhere, and I can see some sandbags and wobbly tins. So it's quite a museum that you've got there.
Yeah, one of the things that we realised back in, I say me and my parents, back in the late 2000s, was that more people were showing an interest in what I had, and had been collecting over the previous sort of 15 years. And that meant that we formed this association, a not-for-profit company, that now takes ownership of all the collection and manages that. So there's a few directors and a fair few members of that who help. And those visitors that used to have to sort of rely on coming to see stuff either up in a loft or in a back bedroom of a house or in the garage, now have the opportunity to come and see something that's permanently on display. As you said, I'm sat in front of two mannequin horses that are sat in front of a limbered wagon. One of those horses is covered in pack saddlery. The Wrigley tin surrounds a reproduction dugout that we've built for out of the manuals, that has Vickers MGs inside and on top, and bout filling machines and all of the accessories, so that we can really explain to people when they come up, not just about the gun. It's not, although with the Vickers MG Collection and Research Association, I think that the collection goes much further than just the guns. There's all the accessories that go with that. Those people that have seen the videos that I produced will see that actually very rarely does a gun feature in some of those. We do talk a lot about the equipment that the machine gunners had, their experiences, what they had to know. It's a key aspect of it. Training machine gunners is not simple. Learning this stuff is not simple, and it's remarkable that it was such an organization, certainly the Machine Gun Corps itself. And the things that were learned and the legacy that it's left us to today with machine gunnery is absolutely immense. So it's only right, I think, that we're able to talk about the wider, and in modern defense terms, I talk about capability. If we talk about this wider machine gun capability with its logistics elements, its infrastructure, its personnel, and its information, and all those things that come together to tell the story through the lens of the Vickers machine gun, or down the barrel, perhaps, of the Vickers machine gun.
Yeah, very appropriate. But Britain went to war in 1914 without a machine gun corps. The machine guns were part of infantry battalions.
Yeah, that's right. And that perhaps goes to show that the great leaps that machine gunnery took over that period. It had been part of infantry battalions, 2 guns per battalion, since the late 1800s. And it's not until that we get into this global conflict that we realize machine gunnery is going to play such a part in that. And seeing what the Germans were doing with Maxim guns and how they were using those to start with, that we decide, first of all, we need to up those numbers. So we leap from 2 to 4 in 1915, and I have to say, I've only recently come across enough information to be able to talk confidently about that leap. The leap is not about production of machine guns. It's about how many limbered wagons you can give machine gun sections that determines how many guns they get in many cases. It's fascinating sort of rabbit holes we end up going down. But it leaps from 2 to 4. And then that never really changes actually on a per battalion basis, because the changes are then around brigading and bringing those machine guns together. So over the course of 1915, those machine guns are being brigaded with a brigade machine gun officer, and often being used as 12 or 16 guns together, with the brigade machine gun officer responsible for their use in action, and to some extent responsible for the training of the men, but clearly their administration is still sat in the infantry battalions itself. So the lieutenant colonel of the infantry battalion is responsible for those men, and can rotate them through the machine gun section, can is responsible for replacements into that as well. And clearly that's going to cause some command control, communication difficulties. So the lobbying that gentlemen such as Baker Carr and George Lindsay, who go on to become so much sort of names in tanks and things like that, they're so influential in all of these tactical developments, are lobbying over the course of 1915, for a machine gun corps to be established. And it's then that which enables consistent training, administration, personnel, supply chains to be established and to work. And the change as well from the Maxim, which is what we go to war with, really. There's only 112, I think, is Vickers machine guns produced by the time we go to war. The Maxim needs replacing. Many of those in service are worn out. Some of those are still converted 0.45 inch guns, so really old weapons. And by going over from the Maxim to the Vickers, they're able to produce more guns more quickly. Still not enough, and the original purpose of the Lewis gun is to replace is to enable that growth from 2 to 4 in infantry battalions for the new divisions and new army stuff, where there aren't enough Vickers to go round. It's not until later on it becomes, actually, this works well when you pick it up and carry it. So we get that enabled and all to take place. The Vickers really fits into service. The machine gun corps is embedded. We've got 1 machine gun company per brigade all the way through to 1917, when we get another one. We get a divisional reserve. So now we've got 4 companies in the division. And once again, the problems of growth or the problems of organization at a divisional level, where nothing's being, and many of your listeners will know, very little is being fought below a divisional level at this point in the war, at 1917 onwards. So the machine guns become a divisional level asset, and machine gun battalions are then formed in early 1918. So, there's a real sort of rattle through of machine gun development as an organization, but it goes to show that we get the numbers right, actually, or we get the numbers relatively right early on, but what we end up doing is just changing the organization, the control, simplifying the logistics, simplifying the training and the personnel as well for the rest of the war.
And all of that, I guess, sort of mirrors a development of the use of the weapon from just an infantry support weapon to something a lot more than that, I think.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, the typical thing that's in many people's view is that there will be somebody in a frontline trench looking over the top of that gun, seeing the enemy advance towards them, and firing at them. And yes, when we think about the bridges and the VC actions of Dees and Godley, that's exactly what they're doing. But by the time that we reach the end of the war in 17 and 18, and we have Vimy with 350 odd Vickers machine guns firing overhead barrage fire, 5 million rounds stockpiled ahead of that action, that is a dramatically different situation. By that time, we have the motor machine gun brigades supporting those infantry and cavalry branches of the machine gun corps. The heavy branch is what many people know the machine gun corps for, as being the parent of the tanks. But in reality, it is that cover unit. I hate to say it because it's more than that, and actually the men come across as well. But it is a separate entity very quickly after the use of tanks comes into service. So the infantry and the cavalry by that time are putting all of their efforts together, and I think that command, concentration, and what we learn from 1914 to 1918, because we have to start to use the guns quite mobile again, infantry moving forward, we change our tactics there. But it's such a sort of epitome of the British Army's innovation over that period. This is tactical innovation. This is irrespective of any particular views about generalship, leadership, or anything like that. This is what you could do with the weapons and the technology that you were being faced with.
And it went from that point, like you were saying, where the classic view of a machine gun is some guy behind a weapon banging away at blokes charging towards him, to it being really becoming almost artillery by the end of the war.
Absolutely, and it's a really flexible, a flexible weapon. It's the infantry's artillery. So actually, if you need to pick it up and move forward with it, you can do so. If you need to fire out to 2,700 yards is the maximum for Mark 7 ammunition with the Vickers. If you need to fire out to that range, you can. If you need to fire over the head of your own troops, you can. It's a really flexible capability, and I think that's one thing that it's not a polar view in that, yes, we start the war with direct fire and we end with indirect fire. By the end of the war, we are mixing it up depending on the tactical circumstances and depending on exactly the very specific use. So, do we need 4 guns to support an attack at a battalion level or a raid? Well, you know what? Let's just let's just put 64 guns on that because the divisional commander can do so. They don't need to stockpile ammunition in the same way that artillery does. 303 can be carried forward in its 250 round tins. Quite often an infantry company would be attached to support that, but it doesn't take it doesn't take like railways. It doesn't take big mule trains to carry that stuff forward. The guys are able to do it on foot, which again sort of goes to the reach of the machine gun, in that we have 16 people servicing 2 guns, 16 people at the start of the Great War in a battalion that are specialist machine gunners. That therefore only runs into the hundreds or very low in the 1,000 across the whole army. But when you consider that the machine gun corps at its peak, is 100,000 men trained in machine gunnery, trained limbered wagon drivers and all of those other ancillary roles, but the majority of those are trained machine gunners. So you can see how it dominates actually. It dominates the sort of thinking that we have of the Great War afterwards. So that development it exists in other arms of service as well, and I don't ever I don't ever do that sort of subjective comparison of were they more important than another, because it's foolhardy to do so. But it is one of those where you go, you think of that development over the course of just a few years, and try and understand another arm of service that has that dramatic changes, then you are into those Royal Flying Corps or the flying services. The tanks, to some extent, yes, they do something perhaps the same in a shorter period of time, but then many of the things that they developed that we know of afterwards are developed after the war. But machine gunnery is pretty much all developed during the Great War. There's nothing really new that we learn in the Second World War. There's nothing really new we learn through the experiments, armored experiments or otherwise, in the 20s and 30s. We've done it by then, and actually we regress. We forget things that we were doing in the Great War, and there's probably not that many examples of that. So it's an interesting area to study and research, and it certainly keeps me busy anyway.
Yeah. And the men who joined the machine gun corps, or were selected to join it, they were a bit of a cut above the rest of many other soldiers, weren't they?
Well, it's an interesting and mixed bag, I think, because you do have these men that were transferred in. So when the companies are brigaded in 1915, some of those men are transferred across. The officers are seconded to start with, but it does require a more advanced skill set. I think it is probably an appropriate term, in that doing indirect fire with a machine gun, whether you are the subaltern in charge, the machine gun officer, the subaltern, the sergeant, or anybody else, actually you do need to understand what they're meaning by degrees, what they're meaning by tangent angles, quadrant angles. You need to understand some of that stuff. So even looking at the 10-week course for machine gunners, at the most basic level, it gets to quite technical information. And one of the things that we're endeavoring to do is to try and put people through that course. Actually, one of the ambitions for us over the next couple of years is to document and record training of machine gunners. There are some sensitivities about that and sharing that, but at the end of the day, it's stuff that was developed over 100 years ago now, and we want to show how difficult it is to learn some of that. So we've been doing some of that with our rangefinder training series. Now, alongside the machine gun, the Vickers machine gun throughout its service is this bar and stride rangefinder. So one man in every detachment in the Great War. So one of the 8 men that would support a Vickers would be a range taker. And they would they would be responsible for doing all that judging distances and supporting the section officer and the section sergeant. And what we've done is taken the Second World War manual, albeit it doesn't change that much, and actually we're using Great War instruments to see how difficult some of this stuff is. So with no disrespect to the guys that are doing it, but they're struggling. We're putting those videos out on YouTube. We've had to stop, obviously, because of some of the restrictions over the last 6 months or so, but it's interesting to watch. It's interesting for me to teach as well. I'm stood there at the front in uniform, trying to stay one chapter ahead, and sometimes only getting one paragraph ahead of the guys that are sat in front of me. But it does make you think, well, wait a minute, they were just machine gunners first, and then they were picked to say, well, actually, you're better at maths than those machine gunners. They still have a very good level of understanding, but they had to pick people out from that to do those specialist roles as well. They weren't picked from artillery. They weren't picked from engineers. They weren't picked from special schools. They just all went through the machine gun training centers and were picked out accordingly. And they fell into those different roles. So if you say that base level is a cut above the rest, then depending on what they do, they're trained in every role, but you've got the number 1 who was responsible for firing the gun, but for which pleasure he also got to carry the tripod, the heaviest part of it. So he's the guy that can clear stoppages quickly. He can lay the gun. He understands the angles. He understands degrees and subtending the quadrant angle and things like that a little bit. You then have the number 2 who's responsible for carrying the gun and loading the ammunition and feeding the ammunition. He'll be as good as the number 1, maybe slightly worse, but he'd be able to take over from the number 1 in every situation. The numbers 3 and the number 4 were responsible for carrying ammunition and water to the gun. Water is essential, and it will, depending on rates of fire and things like that, but it will boil up and you will lose a lot of water. And if you lose water, you'll break the gun. If you stop with ammunition, you just wait until you get more ammunition. But if you lose water, you break the gun. So that's where, the peeing in the water jacket and all the sort of boiling tea and things like that from the water jacket, probably not at the same time. But it's where those stories come from. 5 and number 6, the scout and the rangefinder, range taker. And the scout is, scouting is a trade in the army. So you get those specialist trades, and then above that you've got number 7 and number 8. Now sometimes, depending on the period of war, they might just be the limbered wagon drivers. There might be additional gun numbers, but they will all be machine gun trained, and it's and those. So they'll all have an understanding of things. The scout and the range taker are probably the cleverest chaps in that detachment. The number 1 and 2 are probably the most mechanically apt, but they'll move around as well. So it's an interesting mix of people that the machine gun corps takes. And that's before you start to think about the motor machine gun corps and all those guys, with their motorcycle sidecar combinations that have got to have mechanical understanding as well. Hence the links to the tanks. And then the cavalries, and they've got the machine gun corps cavalry branch have got to understand horses too, which 100 years on, I don't envy them. I probably envy them the least. They've got the enemy within, haven't they, with the teeth and everything to tackle too.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, quite a few of the Great War veterans I interviewed were machine gun corps men, and I always had this impression from them that they did consider themselves slightly a cut above the rest. And one of them, George, he in particular, he always called it an elite corps of the British Army. He'd been a pre-war regular, so he had that sort of attitude anyway. But my impression was that they often, as soldiers, acted a bit more independently without having to wait for the orders of officers than perhaps a man in an infantry section.
Yes, and I think that comes with the level of knowledge, isn't it? That they have a knowledge level that enables them to take independent decisions and action, and they're expected to do so for the best of the situation that they see in front of them. That almost sounds like some out of field service regs, which they would have had no awareness of. But that's there. They're expected to be able to do the best with what they can see in front, fire at the targets that present themselves to them, and understand all of the problems that they're likely to face. They've got to understand ammunition consumption and water rate and the rate of fire and things like that. And much of that will come from their experience and training. But if you take sort of the consideration of the definition of elite, which is sort of specially picked and then specially trained, then absolutely, they do fit into that. And they take the moniker the Suicide Club. I'm not sure when that comes in, actually. I'm always hoping for answers on that one. But they do take the moniker of the Suicide Club because they're there sat behind their guns. And if we take perhaps the stereotypical example of a German machine gunner sat behind his MG08, we think of him staying there while the advances coming upon them under shell fire, chained to their guns, as the myth goes. But you would think of those as Suicide Club. Very much so. So the moniker fitting is very fitting for the British, Canadian, and Dominion and Empire machine gun corps as well.
And their casualty level was quite high, wasn't it?
Yes, it was, and you certainly see that with the turnover towards the end of the war. And I mentioned my great uncle was killed on 21st of March 1918. Looking at around casualty stats and stuff for that day, obviously that was elevated across the army, but particularly across the machine gun corps, because in that defensive action, they are sat behind their guns. They are acting as mobile reserves. They're acting sometimes on a battalion level, completely independently from anything that's happening at all.
And I would guess that that period in which they were looking at redoubts with machine guns in, which were essentially isolated from a main defensive line, it must have been a difficult period of the war for machine gunners, suddenly seeing the enemy all around them.
Yeah, I mean, we one of the reasons I know we started talking about this stuff was we're reprinting the history of the 33rd Battalion, the Machine Gun Corps at the moment. And that history memoir runs through from their formation in 1916, a little bit of sort of prelude stuff, but then it really focuses on the actions in 1917 and particularly 1918. And Hutchison, the Lieutenant Colonel, sort of quite infamous Lieutenant Colonel Hutchison, he recites an account in there where they were being used. The companies were being used independent of any infantry support whatsoever, and they were creating stop lines, and they were having to stop advances, and they were capable of doing so. If you move a company of machine guns, that's not too many men, but it is 16 machine guns. And if you can move them into position quite quickly, you can stop an advance. You don't need infantry support to do that. You certainly need infantry support to protect your flanks and your assets and things like that. But for all intents and purposes, you are the stopping power. You are the firepower that is going to defend the whole division at that point. So a really critical role for them, yes.
You mentioned dear old Hutchie there. I mean, anyone with an interest in the Great War come across Graham Seaton Hutchinson at some point, and it's great that you're reprinting the 33rd machine gun history. But he wrote a huge amount of stuff.
Yeah.
I mean, a fascinating guy, and quite a controversial one in many respects. And I like the fact that one of the things that you're doing is debunking some of the myths connected with machine guns, including his famous claim of this tremendous barrage that he laid down at High Wood.
Yeah, so that's probably what's sort of carried me on along this journey of studying the 33rd Battalion. I mean, it gets some response that, look, they've got their history, they've been studied enough. Why do you need to study them anymore? And perhaps it's a bit like some of the airborne units and things like that. There's so much of the Second World War written about those. Why is there anything else to write? So, but when you start to pick away at the 33rd Battalion history, you realize that 1919, it must be one of the first memoirs being written at a unit level, and therefore influences everything for so long afterwards. Hutchison starts to form the Machine Gun Corps Royal Comrades Association in 36, and possibly dominates the conversations that happen as well. But 1919 is the first mention of this 1 million rounds being fired at High Wood, and it permeates through every mention of machine gunnery in the Great War from then on, really, because he reinforces that in 1938, because he writes machine guns, their tactics and the tactical application and employment, being also a history of the Machine Gun Corps, which it very much isn't, sadly, but it repeats that account. It gets some of it different, some of it's wrong, depending on which version you believe. But then it appears in so many other histories, some very eminent works as well. And a chap called Rich Willis, that many people will know from his sort of social media presence and Western Front Association activities and things like that, came to me a few years ago and started asking very random and very technical questions about how big's a pile of ammunition boxes of 1 million rounds? How long would that take to fill with the bout filling machines and things like that? And we started to scratch away at the story, and quite quickly we came across, as we were now able to do, the war diaries of the 100th Machine Gun Company, which is the one that's mentioned. And the account goes that 10 guns of the 100th Machine Gun Company fired 999,750 rounds in 12 hours. And one of those, Sergeant Dean, fires 120,000 rounds on his own. So he gets a 5th rank prize or something, however it goes. And once you start to scratch away at the surface, you dig out the war diaries, and it says 99,750. So it's missing a number there, and there's no mention of it whatsoever. One of the great things that we did to debunk the myth, because clearly you can get administrative and clerical errors and all of this thing, was looked at it from several different angles. And I've become an academic over the years from proper jobs. I'm now into academia, and so sort of research, testing, and methodology. We start to look at from several different angles, and one of those was actually, was it technically feasible? So there's me with sort of my machine gunnery head on and saying how long would it take you to fill 1 million rounds worth of ammunition? Because we've got, at this point, the stuff is not coming from factories in bouts. It's down to the machine gun company, and we reckon it would take about a week of all of the bout filling machines of the company, which is 1 for every 2 guns, so eight bout filling machines running pretty constantly. It would take you about a week to fill 1 million rounds of ammunition ahead of the operation. So technically feasible if you had a week to do it. Checking the war diary again, there's no mention of it ahead of that action that they're filling bouts all week. There would have been, looking at the other entries, there would have been. They're also actually quite busy, 2 or 3 days before. High Wood is not an independent action of the battle. Certainly not towards the end of August. This is the 24th, 25th action. And it's one where you go, okay, how many men would you need to carry that forward? How long would it take? What stockpiles? None of that's mentioned. So you can start to believe that 99,750, a lot more. But technically the Vickers is capable of doing it. So that's where I sit here from a Vickers MG sort of aficionado going, yes, it could do it, but it just didn't. So the story's great, and it reminds us of the capabilities of machine gunnery, but it just didn't happen, I'm afraid. So we have included that whole so that was published in the First World War Studies Journal a couple of years ago now. We've included our preprint of that as an appendix to the 33rd Battalion history. We've also gone through it and picked out some of the other areas which we think might be elaborated or embellished in some way, just to provide it with a refreshing look for somebody looking at that now, thinking that, wow, it's written in 1919, it must be correct because it's just after the war. So it's enabled us to make sure that people, if they are going to research the Machine Gun Corps or the British Army, the 33rd Division, or any of those things, that they get the most accurate information available to them. We've also helped set it into some context because 1919, it's 1,000 copies being produced. Most of those people are so it's for the battalion, it's for the members of the battalion, it's for their families. They're going to understand acronyms and they're going to understand terms of the day. So we've sort of produced a full abbreviations table, explained some of those things, and which many of us researchers and historians love. We've indexed it. So if you want to look up a name, a place, a unit, we've indexed it, which is a godsend, really, for future research. We're doing some spin-offs too, so some stuff we can't include within a printed document, but we're setting up a Google map at the moment. So if somebody wants to know the locations, Tom, one of the members of the association, has got a GIS background, and he's building that for us, so we're able to share that alongside the book. Irrespective of whether people order the book or not, that will be available. And we're also going through and identifying the likes of the Imperial War Museum photos that relate to 33rd Battalion, sharing some of those, not in the book, although the book does contain many of them, but being printed in 1919, it's before the commercialization of those photos happens. So it's been a really enjoyable experience, actually. And we're in the last, so I'm speaking to you at the end of April, we're in the last few days of preparing that for printing now. So we're still taking pre-orders. We think we've pitched the book at a really interesting price of £25. The original copies go anywhere from £100 to £400. It's amazing.
Absolutely, I've seen them for staggering prices at book fairs.
And you'll know it's absolutely brilliant material because there's watercolors throughout. It's great photos throughout. There's good maps and things like that. So it's a really interesting book. So we think £25 is a reasonable amount for that. And we're making available the prints as well. We've done those as much higher scans, higher resolution scans. So if anybody's got a study or library or anything they need to adorn with something characterful, then those are great. Most of which were painted by Hutchison. And if they weren't painted by or weren't sketched and painted at the time, they were sketched by other members of the battalion. So they bring it quite nicely together. It's been a remarkable experience actually working through it. We've had many conversations with the Hutchison family actually as a result of we had some connections with them anyway through the wider work of the Machine Gun Corps History Project, which is coming up to 20 years of effort now to put together a full history of the Machine Gun Corps, and we're looking to get the first part of that out next year. But we had some connections with the Hutchison family to do that. We've since spoke to so many more that are now, have thankfully pre-ordered the book to give to the next generation. So they obviously have quite a few copies of the originals, but to the next generation of the family, they're going to have this reprint as well. So it's been a really rewarding experience and something that will hopefully open up a bit of a publishing arm for us in taking different memoirs. So not just reprints, but some new to print stuff as well. of both of machine gunners, Great War, Second World War, interesting unit accounts, stuff that we think will add value to people's understanding of machine gunnery through its service.
Yeah, I mean, I'm really looking forward to it. I think it's a great project. We'll put a link on the Old Frontline website to the book project so people can find
Thank
you
you.
and order it. I mean, like you say, when you consider the price of an original copy, which I must say they never seem to ever be in very good condition because it's such quite a big book, isn't it? And it doesn't
Yeah.
fit well on any kind of bookcase, really. So whether people sort of kicked it around a bit, I don't know. But no, it's great to see it back in available to people because it is an important memoir. But looking at his exaggeration of those figures, considering when it was printed, which is only a couple of years before the future of the machine gun corps was in doubt. Do you think there's like a political angle there, as it were, from him trying to prove how important it was?
Quite possibly. We know full well that he is a big proponent of machine gunnery. So although he's not one of those key influencing individuals that sorts out the organization in the Great War, we do know that he is lobbying at that, he is a lobbyist basically for machine gunnery. And we see that in 1936 when he forms the Machine Gun Corps Old Comrades Association. We're very privileged to have actually the sort of first copy of the MG magazine, a draft copy, and it's Hutchison's draft. And it's not until I recognized the handwriting on it and went, wait a minute, what, this is amazing. Articles in that first copy do lobby for basically a formation of a machine gun corps in the late 1930s when the machine gun battalions of the Second World War were being established. So the Cheshires, the Middlesex, the Royal Northumberland Fusiliers, the Manchesters and the Kensingtons all provided battalions in the Second World War for machine guns, but we didn't put them under a single cap badge. They all came out of the same machine gun training centers and depots, but we didn't put them under a single cap badge. He was lobbying for that. He clearly thought that was the right thing to do. So quite possibly, ahead of, he perhaps foresaw the drawdown of the army as many were expecting. The epilogue of the book is very much written from his farm in Surrey at that point in late 1919, saying, well, some of you are still serving, some of you have been demobbed. It'll be interesting to see what happens. So yeah, it's quite possible. I mean, the debate about whether the machine gun corps should have existed or not is a really interesting one when you consider about how these decisions are made. And it's one I'm asked quite often, really, is why was the machine gun corps disbanded? Because we carried on with the Vickers machine gun. And once you realize that we're not fighting divisional level battles, we're not fighting, we're not even deploying at divisional level in the 20s and 30s because the army shrinks so much again. Why have a separate corps? You don't need the mass barrage effect. You don't need the single machine gun training centers to mass produce your personnel training. They can all go through depots. We have the machine gun school at Netheravon, established in 1922 and manned by by men of the Small Arms and Machine Gun Schools Corps, which becomes the Small Arms School Corps in 1929. That's producing enough instructors, senior NCOs, and having their machine gun concentration camps where they get all of the machine guns of a division to work together on an annual basis. Those things are happening and sort of polishing the skills that they're able to maintain in peacetime. But in wartime, we need dedicated machine guns establishments to produce the men from a basic training level. In peacetime, we don't. It's quite a simple sort of argument that probably still exists today about specialist corps and the nature of defence spending.
Yeah, I guess they're not useful until they are useful again, and that's exactly what happens when they go to war again 20 years later in 39.
Absolutely. And then again, we draw down at the end of the Second World War, and I talked about sort of we regress again, and in Korea, the sort of letters from the Gloucestershire Regiment going, can you just remind us of that indirect fire stuff? Send us the pamphlets because we think we might need it, and then like very literally 6 months later, Imjin happens, and we're around that anniversary at the moment, and it's quite interesting to understand that we forget stuff very quickly. One of the principles of what we do as an association is to remind people of machine gun legacy and machine gunnery as a capability. Let's say through that lens of the Vickers MG. It's not necessarily a popular topic, telling people about machine gunnery. It's not perhaps the fluffy bunny stuff, that it could be, maybe, I don't know, but we do so in a very different way. So yeah, let's say the reprint of the 33rd Battalion is one of those mechanisms. Our own publishing and writing, such as the debunking of that myth, our videos and living history displays, the collection, the physical collection, and things such as this, Paul, talking to you about it now is all absolutely crucial to sort of have this multifaceted approach and understanding of machine gunnery.
Well, absolutely. I mean, it's an important part of the Great War. One of the most important in many respects, alongside the implementation of actual artillery. And visiting a battlefield today without understanding what machine guns were capable of doing and how they were deployed, you can't really fully explain how people fought battles.
No, it's really difficult. And one of the things that we want to be able to do over the next year, over the next 18 months, is provide people with a lot more detail and context about the battles that they may be trying to study. And one of the things that I know you've seen, I've been doing on Twitter and all our social media sort of avenues, is sharing the lessons learned of the day. So the Machine Gun School Instructors Manual is something we're very privileged to have in the collection. Even remarkably, we have 2 copies, and they're different because the way the folio system worked is they put different stuff in it as they learn new material. So it's great to have a 1917 version, but the 1919 version includes all the 1918 stuff. So it's a great example of how we were learning through the Great War, and I think people often overlook the learning that we were doing, so it's a good insight into that. But those are very specific battle actions, and they may talk about a very well-known battle. There's 2 battle action studies of Hill 60. So I was just listening to your podcast about Hill 60 and the caterpillar and everything like that, and being able to picture not only what you were telling me, but because I'd seen those battle action sketch maps and the accounts, but what the machine guns were doing, very specifically what the machine guns were doing during those battles. So what we want to try and do is pull together all of that information, do some specific research into the archives as well, pull together the barrage maps. So you say about the development of artillery, but the cooperation between machine guns and artillery is really sort of peak machine gunnery and peak suppression, which would translate into fires in today's terminology. But it's sort of that, pull all that together so that if somebody's visiting a battlefield, be that Great War, Second World War, or Korea perhaps, they will be able to understand what the machine guns did and will be able to provide them with that information. So that's something that we want to be able to pull together for as many locations as possible. It's a great research opportunity for us and for those that want to get involved with us as well, to produce a portfolio of those actions that battlefield guides, or researchers can dip into, and they'll get an understanding machine gun capability from the material at the front, and then be able to understand how were the machine guns used at Vimy? How were those 358 guns actually deployed, used? How did it happen at High Wood? How did it happen at Nerry? And what were the machine guns doing there? Because surely that's just our battery, but no, Dragoon Guards firing in and protecting the flanks of the battery as they were retreating. Things like that are really interesting to understand. Take it into the Second World War. What were machine guns doing at Casino? There's a few different stories about machine gunnery and how the impact and the combination of both when the New Zealand Corps exists and is doing its firing at Casino, it combines the machine gun assets of the Second New Zealand Div and the Poles. Puts it all together, or Indians. I can't quite remember which one it is off the top of my head, but it puts them all together. And you sort of think, well, Freiburg, he did those sorts of things in the Great War. How much of that gets carried forward? And that's sort of really interesting to understand how those lessons carry forward from key characters in the Great War. Richard Gale, best known for being General Officer Commanding 6th Airborne Div in the Second World War, was a subaltern in the Machine Gun Corps in the Great War. He takes over 6th Airborne Div, where it goes to all the air landing battalions. They've got lovely 20 mil anti-aircraft platoons, but no medium machine guns. So 2 months before, Normandy, 6th of June, they suddenly get Vickers machine guns and get told to train on them. It's remarkable how these things carry over, and we learn those lessons of the Great War so thoroughly. So we want to be able to make sure that people continue to learn those lessons, let's say, by doing this project over the next 18 months. And alongside that, the material on the books and the publishing as well.
No, it's great. I mean, like you say, all of this is interconnected. You can't ever just see the Great War in isolation or the Second World War in isolation. When you visit battlefields like Casino, which is so many echoes of the First World War, when you're standing up on Snake's Head Ridge, looking at the monastery, you can see why they cast a nod back to the previous conflict and thought about things that they could implement.
Absolutely. It's fascinating. Like you say, it's so intrinsically linked between the two that, particularly when, say we're this technology equipment focused organization, that we have the same bit of kit. So, why wouldn't you take the lessons that you had on that bit of kit in the Great War and apply them in the Second World War as well? So yeah, really, really valuable. And that legacy of machine gunnery, that legacy of the machine gun corps, and what it gives us to machine gunnery, is what we're really going to be focusing on next year. So next year, 2022, is the centenary of the disbandment of the machine gun corps. We see it come back. We see it sort of dwindled down to just a few battalions. And the first battalion of the machine gun corps returned from Ireland to Shorncliffe in July 1922, and are disbanded out of Shorncliffe. The tank corps retains that legacy of the cap badge. The small arms school corps retains some of the elements of training, and the fact that the School of Musketry was instrumental in setting up the machine gun school in France. There are some links, but effectively what you see at that point is machine guns disperse to the infantry battalions and disappear. Really, many of the members of the machine gun corps don't necessarily carry on doing machine gunnery at that point, but it's interesting to sort of understand that. So we want to commemorate that from from that legacy perspective. So we're talking about some national exhibitions, some regional links as well, working with the Machine Gun Corps Royal Comrades Association, working with different organizations that have this interest in the Machine Gun Corps. And we're going to spend next year doing that. And we're going to spend next year just trying to make sure that when people go to a battlefield, when they're studying the Great War, when they're studying the Second World War, when they're studying machine gunnery now, so those currently serving soldiers at the Specialist Weapons School, they don't need to, but it enhances their understanding of machine gunnery if they understand where that stuff comes from. So we want to try and get everybody to have a conversation about machine gunnery, in the context and with as much information as possible. So 2022 is going to be a busy year for us in promoting that. And in sharing lots of new material as well. So we're probably going to have some new to print material in the same vein as the 33rd Battalion book. So in the same format, in the same print. We like books that match on the shelves, don't we? It's all important. It makes us happy in our minds. And but also the Machine Gun Corps History Project. So like I said, that's a project of 20 years. It's a 5-part piece of work that has been worked on by many individuals over the years, some of whom have sadly passed away over that period as well. Names that are familiar to people, those that have passed away are Bill Fulton, David Thistlethwaite, and Alan Simcock, are no longer in the project, but Bob Alexander and Martin Casal are still working and still writing for that material as it is at the moment. And I'm writing as well. So I say about I'm writing or listening to your pod about Hill 60. I've written that element of the history, machine gun focused, so really strongly machine gun focused. I'm now having to read and write about Gallipoli. It's an area of study I've never undertaken. You've never looked into Gallipoli, so I'm always learning, and but again, it's always through that lens of machine gunnery. That will start to come out next year. It's unlikely to be the full 5 parts, maybe a couple of those, but let's say it's 20 years in the making. We don't want to rush it at the end now. And say some new to print memoirs in there too.
That sounds like it's going to be a very busy and exciting year for the Machine Gun Corps history. And I mean, you're very active, as you mentioned, on social media. So we'll put a link to that on the podcast website. And I think, I mean, it's such an important part, I think, of well, it's a part that social media can play in helping people understand aspects of the Great War like this, and the material that you've been putting on there, particularly these reports that you mentioned. It's absolutely fascinating to read that. Really fascinating.
Yeah, so it was surprising to come across. Genuinely, when you sort of look at the dates these are printed, because as good War Office documents do, they've got their print date on the bottom, and you realise that's only like 6 months after it happens. And then through some of the other research, we found the call out actually for those reports. So would brigade machine gun officers please report on any interesting actions they've undertaken that would be worthy of a lessons learned document? You think, well, that's this. Wow. So we find that and put it all together. That machine gun school instructors manual is, I think it's 600 pages. These battle actions are about 100 pages of that, maybe 150. So you've got like that whole 10-week course, all the lectures and everything in there as well. It's something that we do have available if people want to purchase that from the association. Then we do have that available as a PDF. It's a big book to reprint, but we've also included the 1919 stuff in there as well. So it's just absolutely fascinating to comprehend how much they were doing. Up in Grantham, where the Machine Gun Training Centre was, Belton Park was the headquarters of that. They built complete replica trench systems that is not unexpected. But this manual actually has the whole layout of that, and then gives you the like A, B, C, D, E, F, G, or it's lettered quite simply, and then each of those letters relates to a different type of machine gun emplacement that is built. So to be able to go to for a subaltern to be able to go round and walk through German machine gun placements that have been captured and replicated in Grantham, French machine gun emplacements if they're ever taking over the French lines, all the different variants of British machine gun emplacements that are suitable as well. And of course, the MGTC weren't just sending troops to the Western Front, Salonika, they were going all around. So the stuff that suits the environment they're going to is being replicated as well. Superb material, and it's one of the only ones that we actually don't share widely because it was scanned and reproduced under the auspices of the Machine Gun Corps History Project before we took that over. So so sort of in deference to the decision they made. But what we do have on our website are I think we're now topping around 550 different downloadable manuals around machine gunnery, around wider understanding of machine gunnery in the context. So that sort of different strategic, operational, tactical level stuff, as well as the technical level handbooks on the guns. So those that know the SS series of manuals of the Great War, we've got various of those to download so people can understand from the primary source material. That is where our research lies. Behind the mannequin horses is a library of about 2,500 books. I can't read all those. I don't intend to. You dip into those, but what we have gone through is downloaded, is scanned and archived all of our primary source material, and that is available, and we have gone through that. So it's where the information comes from. It's superb, and we originally digitized that so that we didn't get it grubby when we were handling machine guns in one corner and then going and looking at the material telling us how to take the next bit apart. But it's turned into such a resource that it's sort of all freely available now. So if people need that information, be it on any aspect of machine gunnery and then some wider stuff as well, it's there and available for them.
Yeah, it's an amazing resource, and it's all credit to what you've been doing to make that available to people. I think that the more you study subjects like the Great War, the more you find you go back to these primary sources, because the more you realise that some of the accepted ideas of certain things are often wrong, and the primary sources can point us back in the right direction.
Absolutely. We still have to end up though with accounts and personnel accounts that add the color to that, don't they? And the lessons learned stuff does add the color to the technical. We'd know how to fire at 3,000 yards, but we wouldn't necessarily know when that was being used unless we had this different material. And it's not until that we understand the veterans accounts and their understanding that thankfully have been well recorded over the years, outside of the unit memoirs, that we can really understand all of the different aspects of it. So we try and build some of that in together, and that's one of the things that, with this idea over the next 18 months of adding the battle action study together, we'll go through our material, go through Machine Gun in 1914-18, Crutchley's book. There's so many different accounts in there that it's great as a single book, but let's add that into the context of the battle action. Let's add that into the technical as well. So look at it from those different angles and bring it all together. It's a really enjoyable task, actually. You'll know you've put enough sort of material together, but it's a great enjoyable task to look at something from so many different angles and understand the niche and the nuances of them.
Absolutely, it's fascinating. Thanks for coming on and talking about this. It really is a fascinating aspect of the Great War and military history, right across that first half of the 20th century. But before we go, I've got to ask you about tapping, about using
Okay.
machine guns to make tea.
So tapping, the sort of 2-inch tap of, so it's something that every machine gunner would have known and taught. So there is a clamp handle on the front of the tripod that you would know as a machine gunner how tight that needs to be, depending on how hard you tap the cross piece of the gun to move it by 2 inches. And that 2 inches at the one end of the gun translates to a known range that you would know as a machine gunner. Again, this is that sort of things you need to know sat behind the Vickers. You would know what that translates to and how wide you would spread your shot, because the Vickers fires in a beaten zone. Not everything hits the one place, and it forms this elliptical shape, oval, where all of the rounds fire. You move that to make sure that you are going to suppress different areas, and all of those other, if you're one of the 64 guns in the battalion, the other 63 are doing the same. So you're spreading your shot, and that's the tap. My grandfather always referred to it as the 2-inch tap. That was simple, quick slap on the cross piece. And it turns into the fire orders as well. So your fire control orders would be 2 taps left, 2 taps right. You would know what you needed to do. Then tea. Yes, I think it was done. I don't think the story of it being done to boil the kettle is right, but if you have a lot of boiling water as a result of firing machine guns, then why set up, why not use that for something that you want to use? If you've got a good water supply, then you would. The accounts do talk about that as well. So we've got a little myth section on the website as whether it is true or not true, blah blah blah. A lot of people would say, well, it's oily, it's got asbestos string in it and bits and pieces like that. well, we're a bit more delicate than being sat in a trench in 1916 or 17 or second line position or wherever we were.
It's not going to be Earl Grey, is it? I don't think.
No, it's going to be grey probably. But yeah, not of the Earl variety. I don't think, if you're using petrol tins to carry up water, it's tainted. If that's what your tea is normally tasting, you're going to go, oh well, oil's a bit different. Yeah, it would have happened, I'm sure. It's also, bear in mind this stuff is boiling, so actually it's purified. If you know about boiling water to get it pure, it's only then it's the physical matter that's in there that's going to put you off. But like I say, I wouldn't be too keen if somebody's just peed in that water jacket because we've run out of water. It's not going to take that taste away, I don't think.
So what you're saying is never accept a cup of tea from a machine guns corps soldier, because you never know what's in it.
Yeah, that's a great adage. And it's not going to be one of those myths we try and debunk on the YouTube channel either.
Yeah. Well, that's fantastic, Richard. Thanks so much for coming on, and we'll put links to you on social media and the book that's coming out and your website and the various other things that you're doing. And we hope to get you back on again sometime to talk about next year and what you're going to do with the centenary of the end of the Machine Gun Corps.
Definitely. Thank you very much.
Cheers. A pleasure. You've been listening to an episode of The Old Front Line with me, military historian Paul Reed. You can follow me on Twitter at Somcorps. You can follow the podcast at Old Frontline Pod. Check out the website at oldfrontline.co.uk, where you'll find lots of podcast extras and photographs and links to books that are mentioned in the podcast. And if you feel like supporting us, you can go to our Patreon page, patreon.com/oldfrontline, or support us on Buy Me a Coffee at buymeacoffee.com/oldfrontline. Links to all of these are on our website. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you again soon.